He spent half his life chasing something he never knew how to name. His body aged, but the urgency inside him remained adolescent, a hunger that nothing could satisfy. One morning, waking before sunrise, he sat on the edge of his bed and felt a different kind of weariness. It wasn't physical, it was an exhaustion of the soul. The search had become a prison disguised as purpose. He looked at the white wall before him and for the first time projected no meaning onto it. He simply saw. And in that simple instant, time stopped demanding answers. What had always been sought was neither out there nor within. It was between the gaze and what is seen, between sound and silence. Truth does not arrive. It reveals itself when the seeker stops trying to be someone who seeks. The weariness of those who spend their lives seeking answers and never feel complete. There is a kind of fatigue that doesn't come from the body or from time. It comes from the soul, worn out from trying so hard to understand itself. The man who seeks meaning in everything carries a sort of spiritual fever. He never sleeps fully, never loves completely, never lives the moment. He is always half absent, eyes fixed on a horizon that never gets closer. Each new book, each new experience, each new promise of enlightenment kindles a flame for a few days, only for it to fade again. And he, mistaking intensity for depth, keeps changing paths as if changing skins. But the more he travels, the more he realizes he remains in the same place. The emptiness that drives him is the same that devours him. It is a fatigue the modern world has learned to disguise with productivity and optimism. Keep going, they say. The meaning is in the journey. But no one warns that the journey itself can be the labyrinth. The seeker begins to confuse movement with evolution, forgetting that the wheel also turns without leaving its place. He convinces himself that with enough effort, truth will become a conquest. Yet the harder he tries, the further he drifts from the simplicity that lies at the root of all wisdom. It is the paradox of the seeker. The more he searches, the less he finds. Behind this endless pursuit lies a subtle fear. The fear of simply being. Being without explanation, without ideal, without a story to justify existence itself. Modern man fears silence because there is no mirror in it to reaffirm him. The void confronts him with his lack of control. And so he runs not toward truth but away from the confrontation with what he truly is. This escape takes on sophisticated masks: spirituality, self-knowledge, purpose. All beautiful names for the same disguised restlessness. There is a cruel irony in this process. The more one seeks fulfillment, the more one feels the incompleteness that drives the search. The soul, saturated with concepts and techniques, begins to protest in silence. A kind of inner dryness emerges. Nothing enchants anymore, nothing surprises. What once was curiosity becomes compulsion. The seeker no longer wants to see truth. He only wants to quiet the discomfort of not having it. But truth does not reveal itself through conquest, but through surrender. It is not a goal at the end of the path. It is the very ground that has always been beneath one's feet. Imagine someone crossing a desert, carrying a large clay jar on their back, believing it holds the essence of life inside. With every step, the jar grows heavier, yet they fear letting it fall, for everything they believe themselves to be is inside it. One day, exhausted, the jar slips from their hands and shatters. They despair until they realize the jar was empty. The entire journey had been driven by the illusion that there was something to protect. This is the seeker's weariness. Protecting a void without realizing the void itself is the truth being sought. This exhaustion carries a hidden beauty. It is the prelude to surrender. The mind only grows tired of seeking when it realizes there is no more ground left to dig. It is at this moment, when the seeker begins to doubt even the search itself, that something new can happen. Fatigue becomes a kind of purification, dissolving the subtle arrogance of believing one could reach the infinite with their own hands. The heavy body, the saturated mind, the heart without direction. All of it prepares the soil for stillness. If you observe closely, this fatigue is not the end. It is the first crack through which the real begins to breathe. The seeker who allows himself to feel exhaustion without trying to fix it begins to glimpse something different, a natural pause, a suspension that demands no answer. In that space, effort loses meaning, and being begins to remember something forgotten, the feeling of being alive without needing to justify life. It is at this point that the observer awakens within the seeker. Try for a moment to simply notice the weight you carry from trying to understand everything. Don't try to release it, just observe. The simple act of seeing the fatigue already begins to dismantle the search. There is something deeply intelligent in that silent gaze. It does not seek to change what is, it only recognizes. And in that recognition, effort collapses. The seeker begins to fade, and what remains is a quiet presence, something that existed before any question. This is the point where the search transforms into contemplation. The same impulse that once chased answers becomes pure perception. The fatigue that seemed an enemy reveals itself as a disguised master. It shows that fulfillment was never the reward of the path, but the backdrop against which all searching unfolds. When the seeker finally stops, not from giving up but from sacred exhaustion, truth, silent and patient, begins to draw near, not out of pity, but because it was always there, waiting for him to stop running. The silent anguish of seeking meaning in everything and still feeling lost inside. There is a pain that doesn't scream, it only pulses, constant, like an underground sound. It is the pain of someone who tries to give meaning to everything and still feels that nothing fits. It is the pain of waking with a mind full of questions and falling asleep with the sense that all answers are incomplete. Modern man has learned to believe that meaning is a piece to be found, a logic hidden behind events. He seeks signs in chaos, interprets coincidences, deciphers symbols, and the more he seeks, the more confused he becomes. Because the universe, in its silent vastness, doesn't speak the language of certainties. It speaks the language of observation, the gaze that forces nothing and expects nothing. But the seeker, impatient, wants to turn mystery into a map. He tries to stitch together meanings where there is only flow. He creates narratives to soothe the discomfort of not knowing. He wants to turn every pain into a lesson, every failure into destiny, every accident into a message. And in doing so, he loses the freshness of the real. The world ceases to be lived and becomes interpreted. Life turns into a puzzle that never fits together. And the more the seeker tries to understand the picture, the more distant he feels from the very experience of being alive. There is a subtle arrogance in the search for meaning, the belief that everything must explain itself before our limited consciousness. But the universe owes nothing to human understanding. It simply is. The tree grows without knowing why. The river flows without asking where. The wind blows without knowing who listens. It is only man who insists on naming the unnameable, and in doing so, he imprisons himself within his own words. The mystery, which should set him free, begins to suffocate. The mind turns the infinite into a closed system, and the being, instead of expanding, contracts. Anguish arises when the intellect tries to possess what can only be lived. It is like trying to bottle the ocean. The more one tries to contain it, the more its essence is lost. And there comes a moment when the soul rebels against this effort. It begins to scream between the lines of life, in the inexplicable fatigue, in the anxiety without cause, in the feeling of being surrounded by everything and yet separated from it all. This is the pain of one who has become a slave to meaning. Behind this movement lies innocence, the genuine desire to understand. But what the seeker doesn't see is that the desire to understand may be the greatest obstacle to seeing. Understanding is born from comparison, from time, from memory. But seeing is born from the now. When man tries to fit experience into a mental mold, he stops feeling what is happening. He becomes a spectator of his own life, an analyst of himself. Everything becomes an object of study, and the subject is exiled from his own presence. This anguish is not a mistake. It is the fracture point where the mind begins to tire of being the center. It tries one last time to assert control over the mystery. And when it fails, the ego experiences what it fears most, the void. Not the void of lack, but the void of vastness. It is at this point that many give up or retreat into doctrines, trying to turn the infinite into dogma. But there is another path, the path of pure observation without conclusion. The path of accepting that perhaps life does not need to make sense to be real. Imagine standing in an open field at night. The sky is immense and silent, and you try with your eyes to grasp the totality of the stars. It's impossible, so you simply lie back on the grass and watch. Gradually, the gaze stops searching and begins to surrender. What once was a frightening emptiness becomes a profound presence. The same happens with life. The moment we stop demanding meaning is the moment we begin to truly feel it. This is the paradox. While we try to understand what living is, we stop living. And when we stop explaining, life finally reveals itself. Meaning is not something to be deciphered. It is something that manifests when the mind falls silent. It is not hidden somewhere in the future, but scattered in every simple gesture, in the touch of water on the hands, in the distant noise of the city, in the silence between two words. There is a greater intelligence in the simple act of observing than in every attempt to understand. Because observing is being present, and being present is the only way to truly exist. The mind seeks safety in answers. The being finds freedom in questions that remain open. When man accepts not knowing, the world ceases to be an enigma and becomes a miracle again. If you allow it, breathe for a moment without trying to assign meaning to the breath. Just feel the air come in and go out. This movement, so ordinary and invisible, holds more truth than any theory about what it means to live. Meaning is not in words, it is in the direct experience of now. It is there that emptiness stops being frightening and becomes fullness. And so, little by little, the silent anguish begins to dissolve, not because it found an answer, but because it realized it may never need one. The seeker understands that life is not something to be comprehended, but something to be witnessed. And in that witnessing, a strange peace is born, one without reason, the first breath of a gaze that has finally learned to see. When the mind tries to control awakening and turns the journey into suffering, the moment someone realizes there is something beyond the surface of life often feels like the beginning of liberation. A crack opens, a flash of lucidity pierces the everyday, and the person feels they have finally found the trail of what they always sought. But what happens next is almost inevitable. The mind rushes to take possession of the experience. It turns the glimpse into a project, the mystery into a method, awakening into a goal. What was born as expansion becomes just another form of control. The ego, silently, puts on the clothes of spirituality and continues to run the show. It is at this point that the journey, once sacred, begins to become a battlefield. The mind, believing it is evolving, creates a new identity. The awakened me, the conscious me, the me who understands. But behind these masks lies the same old movement, the fear of disappearing. The mind wants to become enlightened without dying, to transcend without dissolving. And so it begins to monitor every thought, every emotion, trying to mold its own spirit according to the image of an ideal of purity. It is a silent, yet relentless effort, like a tense breath that never relaxes. Suffering is born exactly there, in the clash between what is and what the mind believes should be. Living experience becomes a constant examination. The seeker judges himself for still feeling anger, for still desiring, for still getting distracted. He confuses vigilance with presence and ends up living in a state of spiritual tension. With each failure, he feels farther from the truth, when in reality, it is precisely this attempt at control that distances him from it. Awakening is not a moral prize, but the dissolution of the one who expects to win it. This trap is subtle because it disguises itself as progress. The spiritual ego is more refined than the ordinary ego. It speaks of surrender, but demands results. It speaks of love but seeks approval. It speaks of silence but boasts of being above the noise. All of this is just the old mechanism of control operating under new words. When the mind tries to own awakening, it turns it into an object. And an object, by definition, is always out of reach of the one who desires it. Thus the seeker runs in circles, believing he is ascending when he is merely repeating the pattern of effort. The mind cannot bear the idea that true awakening cannot be managed. It happens when the mind loses command, and this for the ego is the greatest possible threat. Therefore it creates a false awakening, a manufactured state of serenity and self-control. But true silence is not born of repression. It is born when control falls apart completely. The mind tries to stay in front, but the real only blossoms when it kneels. Imagine a river trying to control its own course. It contracts, creates artificial detours, tries to avoid the rocks, but ends up becoming an exhausted trickle without the strength to go on. When it finally yields to its natural bed, it discovers there has always been a path traced by the very gravity of life. Awakening is this: surrender to the current that has always been guiding, even when it seemed like chaos. The mind, however, fears this force because it cannot command it. Spiritual suffering is the price of resisting the inevitable. The seeker feels as if there are two within him, one who wants to let go and another who insists on maintaining control. This conflict creates an invisible tension, a continuous noise that keeps him from resting. At every moment of stillness, the ego slips in and tries to measure progress. Am I more awake today than yesterday? Am I feeling more presence? But awakening is not an upward line. It is the collapse of the ruler that measures. There is a sweetness in the moment when control reveals itself to be powerless. The exhausted mind begins to admit that it cannot manufacture the infinite. At this point, suffering changes flavor. It is no longer pain that imprisons, but pain that purifies. It is the final friction between the old and the new, between rigidity and flow. When the seeker finally recognizes the futility of control, a space opens. It is as if the ground gave way, and instead of falling, he was supported by the very void. Try to notice for a moment how the mind tries to intervene in everything. It wants to interpret even silence. Observe it without fighting. See how it creates plans to become enlightened, how it evaluates its own progress, how it turns the mystery into a task. Just see. This observation in itself is already a crack in the wall of control. There is nothing to correct, nothing to improve. When the gaze becomes pure, control loses the ground on which it stands. True awakening is not a state to be achieved, but the cessation of the effort to achieve it. There is no technique that leads to the truth, only the lucidity to perceive how much one tries to fabricate it. The mind wants to be the author of transformation, but transformation happens when it stops writing. It is in this instant that the journey ceases to be suffering and becomes surrender. The seeker discovers that the path was never about arriving somewhere, but about emptying himself of who he believed was the traveler. And when that happens, the world suddenly seems the same, but it is whole. The wind, the sound, the breath, everything gains a sharpness that does not depend on effort. Control ceases, and in the space it occupied, a peace without an owner arises. Awakening then ceases to be a goal and becomes a natural state of being alive. The seeker disappears, and what remains is the simple fact of being. The emotional weight of confusing spiritual seeking with fleeing inner pain. There is an ancient, almost inevitable confusion that follows many who turn to spirituality, confusing awakening with anesthesia. The soul, wounded by human experiences, seeks relief, and the promise of transcendence seems the perfect refuge, a place where pains dissolve, where the past is purified and suffering ceases to exist. But behind this impulse lies a silent mistake, trying to escape oneself using the sacred as shelter. Thus, spiritual seeking becomes a refined form of escape. The mind, tired of the world's frustrations, creates the image of a pure place where it will finally rest. And without realizing it, it begins to pursue this place like someone running after a horizon. The problem is that this race is driven by the same energy that caused the pain, the rejection of what is. The seeker says he wants to awaken, but what he really wants is to feel no more. He wants to erase discomfort, guilt, fear. He wants to rid himself of human imperfection. And so, he turns the spiritual path into a disguise for resistance. This escape is subtle. It presents itself as practice, discipline, devotion. But deep down, it is only fear. Fear of facing what still hurts. The seeker meditates to silence the mind, but in truth, he tries to silence the inner voices that ask for recognition. He repeats mantras to connect with the divine, but secretly wishes to forget his own emptiness. He reads sacred texts not out of love for truth, but to replace one pain with a meaning. All this is understandable because no one wants to suffer. However, when the search is born of fear, it becomes a prison. True spirituality is not escape. It is immersion. It is not moving away from pain, but crossing it to the end. It is allowing the wound to reveal what lies beneath its surface. For every pain holds sacred information. It shows the exact point where we still resist life. The seeker who tries to become enlightened to avoid suffering only postpones the encounter with his own shadow. He builds a wall of light around fear, believing he is safe. But the stronger the projected light, the denser the shadow it hides. There is an abyssal difference between transcending and escaping. Escaping is denying what is. Transcending is welcoming what is until it dissolves completely. When the seeker understands this, pain ceases to be an obstacle and becomes a passage. It turns into a teacher. Suffering loses the role of enemy and takes on the role of portal. But for this to happen, courage is needed. The courage to feel without interpretation, to look without trying to fix. Imagine a frightened child hiding in the dark, crying because she believes she is alone. The spiritual seeker is often this child dressed as an adult. He tries to rationalize, to repeat phrases of wisdom, to affirm that everything is perfect, while inside him fear still asks for a lap. True compassion begins when the seeker stops teaching his own pain and begins to listen to it, not to heal it, but to let it exist. Pain, when accepted, dissolves naturally, because what keeps it alive is resistance. The emotional weight of confusing spirituality with escape is devastating. It creates a constant feeling of inadequacy. The seeker feels he is not evolving, that he is not awakened enough, that he still feels too much. This self-judgment keeps him trapped in the same structure of suffering he believed he had transcended. He compares himself to masters and saints, measuring his own humanity against ideals of purity. But awakening is not the end of emotions. It is the reconciliation with them. The awakened one is not the one who does not feel, but the one who feels everything without getting lost. Anger, sadness, loneliness all continue to arise, but they are no longer seen as enemies. They are expressions of the same flow of life. What changes is not the content of experience, but the relationship with it. The seeker stops resisting. The pain that once crushed him becomes light because it no longer needs to be denied. Emotional weight dissolves in acceptance. Try looking within without haste and recognize the exact place where the impulse to seek comes from. Is there a pain there? A fear? A desire to erase something from the past? Just observe. Do not try to turn this into virtue or into guilt. Just see. This honesty is the beginning of true spirituality, because truth never reveals itself to those who pretend. It manifests in the simplicity of those who dare to be transparent with themselves. Inner pain is not a mistake on the spiritual path. It is the very portal of awakening. Every attempt to escape it postpones the encounter with the real. But when pain is welcomed, when it is felt in its totality, it opens like an ancient flower. And at the center of this flower there is silence, a silence that denies nothing, but embraces everything. At this point, the seeker realizes there is nothing left to flee nor to seek. What remains is a kind of peace that does not come from conquest, but from reconciliation. Pain loses the power to govern because it has been listened to the end. The seeker at last understands. The light he sought was not beyond the shadows, it always shone within it. The instant when exhaustion forces the self to stop and silence begins to reveal. There comes a point in the journey when the search itself breaks. No teaching seems to work, no practice offers relief, and even the words that once sounded profound lose their shine. It is as if the universe, with brutal delicacy, removed one by one the invisible supports the seeker used to hold himself up. What remains is a raw emptiness, the tired body, the saturated mind, the disarmed heart. It is the collapse of will. The self, exhausted from trying so hard, surrenders not out of wisdom, but out of depletion. And paradoxically, it is at this point where everything seems lost that the true path begins. Tiredness is not an obstacle. It is the universe's natural gesture, calling the seeker back to the center. When the mind is exhausted, silence appears not as absence, but as pure presence. It does not arrive with heavenly music or epiphanies. It arises as an inner space, simple and vast, where the noise of seeking finally quiets. It is a silence that asks for nothing, that promises nothing. It simply is. All his life, the seeker believed he needed to do something to approach the truth. Think, meditate, purify himself, serve, understand. But when effort reaches its limit, action itself dissolves into sacred inertia. And in this involuntary rest, something greater begins to act. It is as if the self finally stopped being the author of its own transformation and became the stage where it happens. Silence is not conquered. It is revealed when noise grows tired of itself. The moment of exhaustion is a dangerous threshold because the mind tries to resist until the last second. It says, "Don't stop now, you're so close." But what is really close is not the success of the search, it is its end. The mind fears silence because in it, the mind ceases to exist as the center. It would rather go on suffering than disappear into stillness. And yet the moment arrives when even fear is exhausted. That is when the seeker, for the first time, stops completely. It is not a physical stop. It is an inner suspension. Time seems to dilate, the air gains weight, the gaze becomes transparent. The body remains alive, but there is something in it that rests for the first time. There is no longer any desire to understand, to heal, to evolve. All this dissolves in the simplicity of being present. It is as if the entire universe breathed with you, without hurry, without direction, without need. In this state, silence is not an absence of sound, but a living substance. It pulses between the cells, passes through emotions, touches thoughts. Everything continues to exist, but without friction. The pains that once screamed now only dance slowly, without drama. The memories are still there, but they lose the power to wound. The past is not erased, it simply becomes harmless. The mind tries to come closer to analyze what is happening, but finds nothing concrete. What it finds is a presence that cannot be thought, only perceived. This presence is what many call truth, not because it brings answers, but because before it, the questions fall apart. Life no longer needs to be deciphered, it simply is, and that is enough. Silence reveals that there has always been a flow sustaining everything, even chaos, even suffering. The seeker, once obsessed with understanding, realizes that understanding was never necessary. The real does not ask for interpretation, it asks for intimacy. There is a moment in this silence when something shifts deeply within the self. The energy that was previously spent trying to control the experience draws back, and what arises is a kind of peace that cannot be created, only recognized. It is a return to what was never lost. The seeker realizes he has not arrived anywhere. He has only ceased the movement that kept him distant from himself. This is the point at which the self begins to live what it had previously only understood intellectually. The words surrender, presence, truth cease to be concepts and become body, breath, pulse. The silence that seemed empty reveals itself to be full of life. It is the womb of the real, the space where everything manifests and to which everything returns. And perhaps it is at this moment that something within you also wants to stop seeking, fighting, understanding, to simply rest in what is. Allow yourself this now, even for a few seconds. Breathe and feel the weight of your own body supported by something invisible. There is nothing that needs to be corrected, only perceived. Silence demands neither faith nor effort. It asks only one gesture: to stop. Because it is in the seeker's rest that truth finds passage. If this moment of pause touched you in any way, take a deep breath and like this video right now. This helps this message reach others who are also tired of searching. And in the comments, write the sentence, "I allow silence to find me." May this symbolic declaration be the beginning of your own inner rest. The pain of letting go of control and allowing truth to come without effort. Letting go of control seems at first glance like a simple gesture, like opening your hands and letting something fall. But when what needs to be released is the illusion that we are the authors of our own lives, the act becomes almost unbearable. There is a particular pain in allowing the flow of existence to follow its course without interference. It is the pain of dying while still alive, not in the body but in identity. The mind, accustomed to directing every step, to planning, interpreting and protecting, panics at the idea of not controlling. It believes that if it stops commanding, everything will be lost. But what is lost is not the real, it is only the fiction of control. For years, the seeker cultivated the belief that awakening would be the pinnacle of his spiritual autonomy, a state in which he would master his own mind and circumstances. However, true awakening is not mastery over anything, it is the renunciation of mastery itself. It is realizing that life happens through you, not because of you. This realization, though liberating, wounds the deepest pride of the mind. It doesn't want to be the channel, it wants to be the author. It doesn't want to flow, it wants to decide. That's why the act of letting go of control is experienced as a small death. The seeker feels the ground disappear, the future dissolve, the certainties fade away. It's like walking in the fog without knowing if there is ground ahead. Everything within us screams for safety, and letting go is precisely crossing that scream without obeying it. The mind tries to negotiate. I'll let go, but I want to make sure nothing bad happens. This is the last disguise of control, the desire to control even the act of letting go. Truth, however, cannot be summoned or guaranteed. It manifests when all attempts to bring it forth cease. It's like a wind that blows only when there are no barriers. As long as the being insists on commanding the flow, the wind cannot pass. But when resistance tires, the air moves freely, and the presence that has always been there begins to reveal itself. The paradox is that truth comes when we stop calling for it. It blooms in the space that control once occupied. Letting go hurts because it exposes the emptiness that control was covering. Beneath every plan, every certainty, every effort to protect oneself, there is an ancient vulnerability. The mind built strategies not to feel it. Control was the way to avoid helplessness. But helplessness is not the enemy. It is the reminder that we were never separate from the whole. When control dissolves, that vulnerability surfaces, and at first, it feels like fear. The seeker feels as if he is naked before the infinite. However, if he does not flee, if he simply remains present, that fear turns into lightness. Because emptiness, when crossed, reveals itself as the very ground. Letting go of control is opening space for life to show us that it always knew the way. And this is a sacred humiliation, realizing that all the effort to command was unnecessary. The mind resists because it associates surrender with powerlessness, when in fact it's the opposite. Control is what weakens us. The constant effort to keep the world under surveillance drains vital energy. When we let go, that energy returns. It's like dropping a rope we've been pulling alone, believing we were fighting against destiny when, in truth, we were fighting against ourselves. There are moments when life, with relentless precision, forces us to let go. A loss, an illness, an emotional collapse. Something greater takes power out of our hands. And there, between despair and acceptance, we discover what it truly means to trust. Trust is not expecting everything to turn out well. It is allowing everything to be what it is. The mind for the first time realizes that there is no way to control the uncontrollable, and in that recognition, a silent peace begins to emerge. Imagine a leaf falling from a branch, surrendering to the wind. It doesn't choose the movement, it doesn't question the destination, and yet it lands exactly where it should. Life operates with this same invisible precision, but we, believing we know better, fight against the current. Letting go, therefore, is to become a leaf again, allowing yourself to fall without knowing where you will land, trusting that the air itself knows the way. This process is not linear. Sometimes we let go and then grab hold again, believing that surrender is a permanent state. But surrender is a living movement. It happens in every instant, in every breath. Letting go is dying and being reborn 1,000 times a day until the gesture becomes natural. Until the being, tired of struggling, realizes there is nothing outside the flow, that everything, even resistance, is part of the same movement that leads everything to the real. And when finally control dissolves, The pain that once seemed unbearable turns into sweetness, because surrender reveals that there was never anything to protect. The seeker realizes that what he tried so hard to hold onto was made of the same substance as the wind, and the wind, by nature, cannot be contained. In that instant, truth comes, silent, effortless, without warning. Not because it was called, but because the space was created. The mind grows quiet, the heart opens, and the being realizes it was always being guided, even when it believed it was in command. Letting go, after all, is not losing. It is allowing life to reveal what it has always known about us. The power of observation that dissolves fear and brings clarity without needing to understand. There is a moment when the gaze changes place. It ceases to be a tool of the mind and becomes a window of the being. In that instant, the act of observing transforms. It is no longer an attempt to analyze, explain, or decipher what happens, but simply to allow the real to reveal itself on its own. And that's when the power of observation shows itself in its true dimension. Observing is different from thinking about something. It is a state of silent lucidity that dissolves fear because, when one observes with totality, nothing is separate from what observes. Fear is born from the division between the I and the world, but in pure seeing that separation disappears. Throughout life, we have learned to look through the filter of judgment. When something happens, we immediately interpret good, bad, right, wrong, desirable, dangerous. This automatic reaction creates a wall between us and reality. We observe, but always through a distorted lens. And the more we judge, the more fear grows. Because judgment is the seed of resistance. What we label as bad becomes a threat. What we call good, we fear to lose. The ordinary observer lives in constant defense, trying to hold on to what pleases and push away what bothers. But there is another kind of gaze, one that sees without choosing. A gaze so pure that it does not rely on memory, expectation, or belief. This gaze does not seek safety, it seeks to see. It does not try to transform what it observes, it simply allows itself to be permeated by the experience. When the being settles into this way of seeing, something miraculous happens. The mind loses the power to fabricate fear. Fear needs time and image to exist. Pure seeing happens in the now, where fear cannot breathe. That is why simple observation is so transformative. It does not fight the shadow, it merely illuminates it. And when the light of attention touches something, that thing loses its power to dominate. Have you noticed how fear dissolves when it is fully felt, without resistance? The secret is not to fight it, but to see it head-on without running away. Observing fear is taking it out of darkness. It feeds on forgetfulness and denial. When it is looked at with presence, it reveals itself for what it is, a transient energy, a contraction of the body, a wave that comes and goes. Observation is the first gesture of freedom, because while you observe, you are not being dragged along. The simple act of seeing creates a space between the phenomenon and the reaction. In that space, consciousness breathes. It is there that clarity arises, not intellectual clarity made of conclusions and theories, but a silent, almost physical clarity. What once was confusion becomes transparent, not because it was resolved, but because it was seen. To see is to heal without effort. Imagine you've been in a dark room for a long time. Suddenly, a crack of light opens in the wall. The furniture that once seemed threatening reveals itself as ordinary. The shadow that caused fear was only a chair. What changed? The light. The object remained the same, but the gaze transformed. The power of observation is that crack. It does not destroy what exists. It only reveals the nature of what is. The mind often believes it can only be free from fear by understanding its causes. It wants to reason out the trauma, decipher the origin, create a map of pain. But true observation does not need to understand to free. It is intelligence itself operating, and that intelligence does not belong to the personal mind. It is something greater, a field of perception that acts on its own. When you observe effortlessly, you are allowing that intelligence to act, and it acts with precision, dissolving what is illusory and leaving only what is essential. This way of seeing is a living practice, though it resembles no practice at all. It can happen at any moment, in the midst of an anxious thought, during a conversation, while walking. You only need to remember to look, not to change what happens, but to see what truly happens. It is a constant return to the point of presence, where the observer and the observed are a single movement. With time, or rather without time, the being begins to perceive that there is nothing outside this gaze, that everything that seemed separate is contained within the same consciousness that observes, and in this perception, fear loses its place. Because fear is always the projection of an imaginary separation. When everything is seen as part of the same field, what could threaten what? The pure gaze is the dissolution of the boundary between inside and outside, between self and other, between now and later. To allow yourself to observe is, therefore, to allow yourself to exist. The pure gaze does not demand perfection. It embraces chaos, error, the unfinished. It knows that nothing needs to be fixed, only silently understood. It is in that silence that clarity blooms, a clarity that does not come from the effort to understand, but from the grace of seeing. The world, when seen this way, ceases to be a problem to solve and becomes a continuous revelation. And perhaps that is the true meaning of wisdom, not to accumulate answers, but to sustain the gaze. When the gaze is steady, fear finds no home. The mind may still try to fabricate doubts, but they dissolve in the calm light of observation. What remains is presence, clear, simple, and free. Truth then no longer needs to be sought or understood. It is there, in the same place where the gaze rests, silent and whole. When surrender turns emptiness into presence and seeking into peace, there comes a moment when the emptiness, once feared, begins to change shape. What once seemed like absence reveals itself as space. The seeker, already tired of resisting, discovers that there is nothing left to let go of, because everything is already gone. Ideas, desires, even questions, all the noises that filled the silence dissipate like smoke. And in the place of fear, there arises a stillness that was not created, only recognized. It is surrender, not as a heroic act, but as the natural consequence of the end of resistance. To surrender is not to give up on life, but to stop fighting against it. The mind fears this distinction because it believes that control is what keeps everything in order. But when the being truly surrenders, it realizes that order is deeper than any plan that could have been drawn. It is a silent harmony that reveals itself in the rhythm of one's own breathing, in the distant sound of the wind, in the simple fact of being alive. Surrender does not change the world, but it changes the way the world is perceived. What was once a threat becomes a passage. What was once lack becomes fullness. Emptiness, when welcomed, begins to pulse. It ceases to be an absence and becomes presence, a living, silent presence that needs no explanation. It is the space that sustains all forms and at the same time exists beyond them all. The seeker, now more mature, realizes that this presence is not something he attains, but something that has always been there, waiting for him to stop trying to reach it. The emptiness that once hurt now breathes within him, like an invisible heart. It is curious how the fear of surrender comes precisely from the habit of identifying with effort. The mind built itself upon the belief that to exist is to struggle, and when the struggle ends, it feels that it dies along with it. However, what dies is only the idea of separation. Surrender reveals that the being was never separate from life. It was life itself trying to remember itself. When that remembrance ignites, the entire world changes texture. Time seems to slow down, the body feels light, and each moment becomes complete in itself. This silent presence demands no conditions. It does not depend on achievements, certainties, or understanding. It is the background of everything, even confusion, pain, and doubt. The difference is that now the seeker no longer confuses himself with the movement. He is the space that contains it. And that simple shift changes everything. Before, the search happened within effort. Now the search happens within peace. It is a paradox. The seeker continues living, loving, erring, dreaming, but without losing his center. The center is no longer in things, but in the presence that observes them all. In this state, the world ceases to be a sequence of events to control and becomes a flow to be lived. Surrender transforms even suffering into part of the sacred. Pain, when observed without rejection, loses its hardness. Pleasure, when lived without attachment, loses its poison. Everything becomes pure experience, free from interpretation, free from guilt. It is as if life unfolds within a vast calm. Nothing needs to be different from what it is. This serenity is not an emotion, it is a field of consciousness. The seeker discovers that peace is not the absence of turbulence, but the stillness that observes turbulence without getting lost in it. It is the silent vastness of the ocean beneath the waves. Even when the surface stirs, the depth remains unmoved. It is in this depth that surrender happens, not in words, but in the direct recognition of what has always been there. However, surrender is not a final point. It is the beginning of a new way of existing. The search that once was effort now becomes living curiosity. The being begins to move not out of lack, but out of fullness. Life ceases to be a path to walk and becomes a spontaneous dance between what is seen and what observes. Control disappears, but action continues. Only now it is born from listening, not imposition. Action comes from silence, and that is why it is precise. Imagine the moment when a drop of water finally surrenders to the ocean. During the entire fall, it fears disappearing. But when it touches the surface, there is no death, there is expansion. The drop does not lose its essence, it simply discovers that it has always been the ocean. So it is with the being that surrenders. The limited I dissolves, and the infinite breathes through it. The search then fulfills its purpose, not to lead somewhere, but to return the seeker to the place he never left. At this point, emptiness and fullness cease to be opposites. They are just faces of the same presence, and the seeker, now silent, understands without thinking. It has always been this. The entire life was a calling to stop resisting. The search was never for something outside, but for a way of seeing that excludes nothing. Surrender reveals that peace is not achieved, it is remembered. And emptiness, when inhabited, becomes home. When the being lives surrender in this way, the world continues to happen, but the weight disappears. Life goes on simple, ordinary, yet imbued with a lucidity that turns even the mundane into the sacred. The presence born from emptiness is so full that the seeker no longer perceives where he ends and where the whole begins. He becomes the very breath of the universe, silent and continuous. When the seeker finally stops, the entire universe seems to stop along with him, not because the world changes, but because the gaze no longer fragments the real. Truth, then, does not arrive. It reveals itself silently, within the space that effort left behind. Everything that once seemed distant becomes intimate. The search transforms into presence, and emptiness into home. There is nothing left to understand, only something to live. The pure instant that breathes without reason. If you felt this stillness echo within you, leave the comment, "I am the silence that observes," so I'll know you made it to the end. And if this content touched you, subscribe now and continue walking with me through these truths that cannot be taught, only remembered.